The island, once bustling with life, stood in eerie silence now. Nestled in the far reaches of the ocean, it seemed an odd place for civilization to have once taken root. But it wasn't always the forgotten, desolate land it appeared to be today. The island's history was rich, filled with stories of families, strangers seeking refuge, and odd whispers about its peculiar reputation. At its peak, this small piece of land hosted a thriving community, with homes dotted along its shores and workers moving busily between fields, trade posts, and docks. Yet all that would change suddenly without any warning, and what followed would be a mystery no one was ever able to completely solve. Rumors about the island began to circulate when people started disappearing. It wasn't just that the island became empty, it was as if it had been scrubbed from existence. No one officially left, at least not in the eyes of any governing bodies. No formal records of deaths, no final reports, no official closure. It was as if everyone just vanished, leaving nothing behind but rotting wooden structures and abandoned tools. The first sign that something was amiss came when the boats stopped coming. For years, the island had been supplied with goods and provisions from neighboring ports. But one year the shipments stopped. No one could explain why. The local shipping lanes were clear, the vessels on schedule, yet the island remained isolated. One by one the families that lived there disappeared. At first it was brushed off as simple migration. After all, people move, right? But then there were whispers that didn't fit the narrative. People would leave their homes intact, their personal belongings undisturbed, as if they had planned to return. But they never did. No one came to search for them. No official investigation was initiated, and no one seemed to notice. It was as though the island had never been inhabited. Those who passed by didn't even know where to begin looking for answers. There were no bodies, no graves, no signs of any tragedy. It was as if an entire community had been erased from the world, leaving nothing in their place but the abandoned landscape. The few outsiders who ventured there after the evacuation, or what seemed to be an evacuation, returned with unsettling tales of strange occurrences. Unexplainable sounds, shadows that moved where they shouldn't have, and artifacts that didn't belong to the island's known culture. But even these stories were sparse. Word quickly spread that it was a place best left alone. Then there were the strange symbols. Some claimed they saw them etched into the island's trees, carved into rocks on the shore, or even marked in the sand. Yet no one ever found a source for the strange carvings. The authorities, when asked about them, always seemed to change the subject or claim that there was nothing to be worried about. But for those who had lived on the island or spent time near it, these symbols were a clear signal. A warning. Something had gone horribly wrong. It didn't take long before the island began to attract the curious. Locals, journalists, even paranormal investigators, all arrived, each with their own theories about what had happened. But as each person came, the more the mystery deepened. No one could explain the eerie feeling that hung in the air. No one could reconcile the sight of empty homes, untouched furniture, and walls covered in strange markings. There was no sign of any kind of natural disaster. No flood, no fire, no earthquake. Nothing that would account for the complete abandonment of a thriving community. As time passed, the stories grew. They became more elaborate, more vivid. Some claimed the island was cursed. Others suggested that the people who lived there had been part of a ritual, something hidden, something secret, something forbidden. And some, in hushed voices, spoke of an ancient evil that had awakened on the island, something that had not been seen in centuries but was nonetheless still very much alive. Still, the island remained off-limits. Any attempts to re-establish contact with the place were met with bureaucratic red tape. The government wouldn't allow ships to dock there, and helicopters were denied permission to fly overhead. It was as if they were trying to prevent the island's story from ever being told. But there were always those who pushed for the truth to come out. The truth, however, was never easy to grasp. Investigators who ventured there were met with confusion and resistance from locals. The island's existence seemed to be one long, drawn-out enigma. Any evidence found, no matter how small, was quickly dismissed. Yet there was something hauntingly persistent about it. The more people tried to understand the truth of the island, the more impossible it seemed to grasp. It was only when a team of international researchers, experts in archaeology, anthropology, and cryptography, began to dig deeper into the island's origins that the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The team, led by an experienced archaeologist who had been involved in the investigation of similar mysterious disappearances, began by focusing on the island's history. What had brought the original settlers there? What was their connection to the land, and why had they chosen such an isolated and remote spot? What they uncovered was both surprising and terrifying. The island was much older than anyone had realized. Its history stretched back centuries to a time long before modern records were kept. And it was connected to a much larger network of ancient civilizations, some of which had long since disappeared without a trace. The settlers who had come to the island had not simply sought a new life, but had, in some sense, been chosen. They had come to this land for reasons that were hidden deep within the island's past. One of the most curious discoveries was a series of ancient stone tablets found deep beneath the island's overgrown jungle. These tablets, though weathered and cracked, depicted strange symbols and images that seemed to tell the story of a ritual. A ritual that, according to the researchers, could have involved the sacrifice of human life. But not just any human life. The ritual seemed to point to something much darker, something that had the potential to affect not just the people of the island but the entire region. As the team pieced together their findings, a chilling realization began to form. The island's original settlers had known something about the land that no one else had ever suspected. They had made a deal, a pact with something that had been dormant for millennia. And that pact had cost them their lives, literally. They had paid a terrible price for the land, and their descendants had paid even more dearly. What had happened to the island's final inhabitants was not just a random accident. It was the culmination of centuries of secrets hidden from the world. And now, with the truth slowly emerging, it seemed clear that the island had never been forgotten. It had merely been waiting. Waiting for the right people to uncover the dark legacy hidden within its soil. The team's discoveries raised more questions than answers. And as the island's mysterious power began to reassert itself, those who dared to uncover its secrets would soon realize that some mysteries were better left unsolved. The island's origins were steeped in legend, a place where myths collided with reality, and where the land itself seemed to hold secrets that had been passed down through generations, whispered between those who had once called it home. Its first inhabitants were sailors and wanderers, people searching for a place to settle, to build a future, away from the crowded, ever-changing cities of the mainland. When they first arrived, it wasn't the desolate, empty place it would later become. It was a lush, verdant island, covered in dense forests, its beaches framed by clear blue waters, an idyllic paradise that seemed untouched by time. They were not the first to step foot on its shores, of course. There were others before them, though little was known about the first people to inhabit the land. There were no records, no written accounts of their existence, only the ruins they left behind, fragments of ancient structures hidden beneath the foliage, carvings on stones that seemed to speak of something lost, something that could no longer be understood. Some theorized that these first inhabitants had been part of a forgotten civilization, one that had disappeared long before the settlers arrived. But if that was true, why had no one ever heard of it? Why did the island's past remain so shrouded in mystery? The settlers themselves, the ones who had made the island their home in the early days, were driven by a need to escape. Perhaps it was the pressures of their former lives, or the haunting memories of the mainland that pushed them to seek refuge here. Some came seeking a fresh start. Others were running from something, personal tragedies, broken relationships, or the crushing weight of past mistakes. There were no grand plans for the future, no vision of what the island could become. They built modest homes and began farming, living off the land, taking only what they needed. Life on the island, for a time, seemed peaceful, untouched by the world beyond the horizon. Yet, even in its early days, there were hints of something strange about the island. The settlers spoke of an uneasy feeling that seemed to hang in the air. It wasn't something that could be pinpointed exactly, but it was there, like a faint shadow always lingering at the edges of their vision. The island's isolation had a weight to it. The farther they ventured into the dense forests, the more they felt a subtle, almost imperceptible pull, a sense that the island itself was watching them, observing their every move. Some called it superstition, others chalked it up to isolation-induced paranoia, but as time wore on, the strange feeling never went away. The community grew, albeit slowly. There were marriages, births, and the inevitable struggles that came with settling in such a remote place. Yet, as the years passed, the atmosphere grew darker. The first signs of trouble began to emerge when crops started failing, and storms seemed to come from nowhere, wreaking havoc on the settlements. What had once been a fertile island now seemed to turn against its inhabitants. The animals they raised grew sick, the seas they fished from became treacherous, and the very land they had come to rely on seemed to be rejecting them. Despite these setbacks, the settlers remained, refusing to leave. They blamed the misfortunes on bad luck, a series of unfortunate events that could be overcome. But there were others who whispered of something more insidious, something ancient that was stirring beneath the surface of the island. They spoke of old rituals, long-forgotten practices that had been passed down by those who had come before them, rituals designed to placate the forces of the land, to maintain balance and harmony with the island's spirit. Some of the settlers, desperate for an explanation, began to seek out the remnants of these rituals, hoping they might restore the island's favor. What they found, buried deep within the island's forests, was a series of ancient symbols carved into stone, as though etched by hands long dead. Some were simple, geometric shapes. Others were intricate, swirling patterns that seemed to move when gazed at for too long. The symbols were not just decorations, they were part of something much larger, a forgotten language that spoke of the island's power, its connection to forces beyond human understanding. And these symbols, it seemed, were not just ancient art. They were part of a system, a pattern, a way to communicate with the land itself. The settlers began to perform rituals, trying to unlock the meaning of the symbols. They gathered around the stones, chanting the strange words that had been passed down from their ancestors, hoping to summon whatever force lay dormant beneath the island. Some say it was desperation that led them to try these ancient rites. Others claim it was the island itself that called to them, pushing them to seek the knowledge of their forebears. As they delved deeper into the rituals, the island's true nature began to reveal itself. The storms became more violent, the animals more restless. The crops that had once failed began to grow with unnatural speed, but so did the strange, twisted plants that seemed to choke the land. It wasn't long before things began to get worse. People started to disappear, one by one, vanishing without a trace. At first, it was assumed that they had simply left, perhaps overwhelmed by the growing tension on the island, or maybe they had ventured into the forest and gotten lost. But as the disappearances continued, and as the settlers began to uncover more secrets about the island's past, the truth became undeniable. Something was drawing them in. Something far older, far more powerful than anything they had imagined. The settlers' belief in the island's ancient power only grew as the months passed. Their attempts to appease whatever force had been awakened were met with more bizarre occurrences. The sky grew darker, the air heavier, and the very earth seemed to pulse beneath their feet. It was as if the island itself was alive, a living, breathing entity that was slowly consuming them. Those who dared to speak out, to question the rituals or the island's strange hold over them, would disappear in the night, never to be heard from again. It was said that their screams could be heard echoing across the island, but when anyone tried to search for them, they were always met with nothing. No trace, no sign, not even a footprint in the sand. As the island's grip tightened, the settlers began to change. Their eyes grew hollow, their faces gaunt with fear. The once tight-knit community began to splinter as factions formed. Some believed the island had to be appeased at any cost. Others grew fearful, warning that the island's power would consume them all. It was during this period of intense turmoil that the island's fate began to take shape. One by one, the families began to leave, but there was no orderly departure, no mass exodus. They simply vanished. Some took boats and never returned, while others were never seen again. The few who remained behind could not explain why they stayed, but they too were slowly drawn into the island's web. For decades, the island remained in its mysterious state of decay, abandoned by its people and erased from official records. The few who came to investigate found nothing but silence. Even the authorities, when they were finally alerted, could offer no explanation. The island's records were incomplete, its history forgotten, and its story left untold. The truth, it seemed, had been lost to time, buried beneath the earth, just as the settlers had been. When the first whispers of the island's mystery began to spread beyond its immediate vicinity, they were dismissed by many as mere rumors or exaggerations. People had a tendency to sensationalize the strange, to embellish tales with fantastical elements. But something about the disappearance of the island's inhabitants refused to fade. A few brave souls decided that the truth was buried there, on that forsaken piece of land, and they would be the ones to uncover it. They were not the first to attempt an investigation, but they would be the ones who would finally begin to connect the dots. It was a small group of researchers, led by Dr. Victor Hartley, a historian with a specialization in lost civilizations, who decided to take on the case. Hartley had spent years investigating historical mysteries, places and events that had slipped through the cracks of traditional history, and this, in his mind, was the ultimate challenge. The island was an enigma, but every enigma had its key, he believed. All it took was the right combination of curiosity, intellect, and tenacity. Along with him came a diverse team: Eleanor Price, an anthropologist with a particular interest in isolated communities, Isaac Bennett, a cryptographer and linguist, and Rachel Ford, an expert in paranormal phenomena, who was chosen because of the island's rumored supernatural aspects. Their plan was to approach the island in two phases. First, to examine the historical evidence and documents about the island, and then to assess the physical site itself. But when they arrived at the nearest coastal town to board a ship to the island, the hostility of the locals became immediately apparent. The people were cold, distant, and when asked about the island, they quickly shut down the conversation. The town seemed to hold its collective breath whenever the topic was brought up, as if merely speaking of the island would bring bad luck. Despite their best efforts to push for details, the townsfolk refused to speak, and their reluctance made the investigators more determined. Once on the boat, they set sail for the island under a heavy fog that seemed to roll in from nowhere. It was as if nature itself was warning them off. The island, barely visible in the distance, loomed large in the hazy twilight. As they approached the shores, the oppressive silence that greeted them was unsettling. The island was not just deserted, it felt abandoned on a deeper, almost spiritual level. There was no sound of wildlife, no movement of the trees in the wind. It was a place that felt out of sync with the natural world. They docked on the island at a small, derelict pier. The wooden planks creaked underfoot, and the smell of decay hung thick in the air. Their first impression was of something frozen in time. Homes left half-built, tools left scattered, and clothes left hanging on lines as if their owners had been about to return at any moment. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle, just absence. It was as if the place had been abandoned in haste but with no immediate explanation. It was eerie, yet it sparked a sense of unease within them that something more had occurred here than simple abandonment. The team split up to begin their investigation. Hartley and Price started by searching for historical records, while Bennett and Ford set out to explore the area more thoroughly. It didn't take long for them to realize that something was very wrong. Despite the obvious signs of human habitation, there were no traces of the island's once thriving community in any official documents. The government records were incomplete, lost, or deliberately destroyed. Any mention of the island in historical accounts was vague at best, with most references to it appearing only in passing. There were no detailed maps, no census records, and no official documents describing the people who had lived there. It was as if the island had never existed or at least never mattered. As they dug deeper into the abandoned houses, they found strange symbols carved into the walls, some of which were eerily similar to the carvings the early settlers had left behind. The markings appeared to be part of a larger, forgotten language, one that Bennett immediately recognized as related to ancient scripts, though none he had ever seen before. This discovery sent a ripple of excitement through the group. It suggested that the settlers were not simply isolated people who had lost their way, they were part of something far older, something more significant. But the further they delved into these markings, the more unsettling the symbols became. Some were inscribed in places where no one could have easily reached, on the upper parts of walls or even on the ceilings, suggesting that whatever force had driven the islanders to carve them had possessed an almost ritualistic purpose. Rachel Ford, meanwhile, was growing more and more disturbed by the island's atmosphere. Despite her extensive experience with paranormal phenomena, she had never encountered a place so heavy with energy. It wasn't just the abandoned homes or the unsettling silence that gave her pause, it was the sense that something was still very much present on the island, something that was watching them. She began to experience strange sensations, a coldness that would envelop her when she entered certain rooms, whispers she could not trace to any source, and shadows that seemed to shift in the corner of her eye. Her usual skepticism began to waver as she felt an increasing pressure building within the island. It wasn't just the physical remnants of a lost community that haunted them, it was something far more intangible. Days passed as the team scoured the island for any concrete evidence, but their findings only deepened the mystery. As they explored more abandoned structures, they began to notice the oddest thing. Despite the decay of the buildings, the objects inside remained in a disturbingly pristine condition. Furniture, once draped with dust and neglect, appeared to have been recently used. Chairs moved, books left open, the floor covered in footprints that seemed to have been made only hours ago, not years. One night, as the group gathered to discuss their findings, Eleanor Price revealed that she had discovered something even more alarming. While going through the remnants of an old church at the center of the island, she found a journal, hidden away beneath a floorboard, its pages yellowed and brittle. It was the diary of one of the last remaining inhabitants of the island, a woman named Margaret Lawson. Lawson had written about the growing tension among the people in the final months before the island's abandonment. Her entries were filled with fear and confusion, but one entry in particular stood out. "We thought it was the island, but now I wonder if it is the land itself that calls to us. The markings we've uncovered, the strange rituals we've been performing, they seem to have awakened something. Something older." I fear it is not the island that is cursed, but we who have cursed ourselves by staying here. And now, the others are changing. They are no longer the people I knew. The entry ended abruptly, leaving the investigators with more questions than answers. Who were the others? What had they become? And what was this force Margaret spoke of that had been awakened? The journal raised unsettling possibilities. It was clear that the people who had once lived on the island had not simply left due to some natural disaster or external pressure. There had been a transformation, a shift in their very nature. They had changed in ways that even the survivors seemed to struggle to comprehend. And whatever had caused their disappearance was still very much active, lurking in the shadows of the island. The team felt the weight of this discovery pressing down on them. Every new piece of information they uncovered only brought them closer to understanding what had happened, but it also made them realize how little they truly knew. As they spent more time on the island, their sense of unease deepened. It was becoming clear that they were not alone on this forsaken land. The question was no longer whether they could uncover the truth, it was whether they could leave with it. The island's grip was tightening, and the investigators could sense that time was running out. The tension had grown unbearable. Despite the mounting evidence they had gathered, the team felt more uncertain than ever about what they were truly dealing with. Each passing day on the island made it clearer that this place was no ordinary site of abandonment. It was a haunting, a presence that stretched beyond the physical realm, one that seemed to be alive. It wasn't just the eerie silence, the strange markings, or the abandoned homes that weighed heavily on them. It was the persistent feeling that something watched them, waiting for them to make the wrong move. The investigators spent their days combing through the island, documenting their findings, and examining the strange symbols etched into the walls and trees. But their nights were another story. As darkness fell, the island seemed to take on a life of its own. The air grew thick with an almost oppressive stillness. The sounds of the forest, the gentle rustle of the trees, the chirping of nocturnal creatures, ceased altogether. The only noise was the faintest whisper of wind, and even that felt unnatural. It was as though the island itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Rachel Ford, the paranormal expert, became increasingly agitated. The closer they got to uncovering the truth, the stronger the sensations she experienced grew. At first, it was a chill that would creep over her, seeping into her bones, followed by the overwhelming sense that someone, or something, was in the room with her. Then the dreams started. They were vivid, strange dreams that felt more like memories. In them, she would stand in the middle of the island, surrounded by the abandoned homes and overgrown paths. But the people who had once lived there were present, standing just beyond her reach. She could see their faces twisted in fear, their eyes wide and pleading for help. But whenever she tried to move closer, they would vanish, slipping away into the shadows. It was the dreams that unsettled her the most. They were always the same. She couldn't escape them even when she tried to sleep elsewhere on the island. The dreams felt like a warning, but Rachel couldn't understand what it was trying to tell her. The island was not just cursed, it was alive and it was communicating, trying to draw them in. The rest of the team noticed the change in her demeanor. Rachel had always been the rational one, the skeptic who approached everything with a scientific mind, yet now she seemed to be losing her composure. She started to spend more time alone, wandering the island in the dead of night, drawn to areas that seemed to exude the most unease. There was one part of the island, a dense, shadowy grove deep within the forest, that had begun to call to her. It was as though the trees themselves were pulling her in, their twisted branches seeming to beckon her forward. She could not explain why, but she felt an undeniable pull toward that place, a place she had avoided at first. Dr. Hartley, too, had started to show signs of strain. The historian had always prided himself on his ability to maintain a logical, level-headed approach, but as the days wore on, his resolve began to crumble. He spent long hours poring over the ancient texts, the journals, and the fragmented pieces of the island's history, trying to make sense of it all. But the more he uncovered, the more baffling the situation became. There was a pattern to the symbols, a strange, cryptic language that no one could decode. It was as though the people who had lived on the island had been trying to communicate with something, some ancient, otherworldly force, but the message was lost in time. Then came the revelation that changed everything. It was Bennett, the cryptographer, who stumbled upon it. While reviewing the symbols once more, he realized something that had eluded them all. One of the symbols was not a symbol at all. It was a code, a cipher that had been embedded within the markings. When decoded, it revealed a message, one that sent a shiver down his spine. The message was simple but chilling: the island will take what it is owed. At first, the group dismissed it as nothing more than another cryptic warning, a remnant of the islanders' superstitions. But as they thought more about it, the implications began to sink in. What was the island owed? And who had the power to claim it? Was this a warning to leave, or was it a call to something far more sinister? As the days wore on, the unease grew. Rachel's behavior became more erratic, her obsession with the grove intensifying. She would speak of hearing voices, whispers that seemed to come from the very earth beneath her feet, murmuring words in a language no one understood. The others were concerned, but Rachel insisted that she was getting closer to the truth, that she could feel the island's presence all around her. She felt connected to it, as though it was speaking directly to her, and she believed that only by fully understanding its power could they escape. It wasn't long before her obsession led her to the grove. The others followed her one evening, fearful that she would disappear into the shadows once more, but they could not reach her in time. By the time they arrived at the edge of the forest, Rachel was gone. They called out to her, but there was no response. The island had claimed her. The team searched frantically, calling her name, but it was as if the island itself had swallowed her up. It wasn't until they stumbled upon a clearing deep within the grove that they found any trace of her. There, lying motionless on the ground, was Rachel. But she was not alone. She was surrounded by the same strange symbols, now glowing faintly in the moonlight. The earth beneath her was cracked as if something had torn through it, and her body was covered in an odd, shimmering dust. Hartley and Price rushed to her side, but Rachel's eyes were wide open, unblinking, staring at something only she could see. She was trembling, her body convulsing in spasms. When they tried to speak to her, she could not respond. It was as if she had been possessed by something far more powerful than any of them could comprehend. They carried her back to the camp, but as the hours passed, Rachel's condition worsened. Her body seemed to grow colder, her skin growing paler by the minute. In her delirium, she muttered fragmented sentences, fragments of the language she had been hearing in the forest. She spoke of awakening, of sacrifice, and of the island's hunger. The others were at a loss. They knew they had to leave, but how could they abandon Rachel? And what had she discovered in that grove that had led to this? What was the island truly after? The night passed in a tense, suffocating silence, and when dawn finally broke, Rachel's condition had reached its breaking point. She was no longer responsive, her body lying still as if the life had been drained from her. It was clear now that the island had taken what it was owed, and Rachel had become the price. But what did that mean for the rest of them? Was the island merely a resting place for an ancient curse, or had it become something far more dangerous? The investigators were no longer certain that they could uncover the truth, and the questions grew darker with each passing hour. What force had they awakened? What had Rachel discovered that had cost her so dearly? And what would happen if they remained on the island any longer? The answers, it seemed, were buried deep within the island's heart, waiting for them to return and finish what had been started long ago. But now the stakes were higher than ever before. The island was not merely a place of mystery, it was a force, a living entity that demanded something in exchange for its silence. The question was no longer whether they could uncover the truth, but whether they would survive long enough to tell it. As the days passed, the tension on the island thickened, and the unsettling realization of what they were up against began to settle into the team. They had crossed a threshold, one that could not be undone. The discovery of Rachel's condition, and the chilling evidence that the island had claimed its price, left them all questioning their next move. Every step they took seemed to bring them closer to an answer, but each answer raised more terrifying questions. Rachel's body, cold and still, had become a symbol of the island's power, a grim reminder of what awaited anyone who dared to uncover its secrets. As much as they wanted to believe they could simply leave, the island seemed to have other plans. The lingering feeling of being watched, the sense that the land itself was conscious, was more overwhelming than ever. It was as if they were being drawn deeper into something far more sinister than they had ever imagined. Even the once logical Dr. Hartley found himself questioning his own understanding of history and reality. In the days that followed, the team tried to make sense of Rachel's condition, but it seemed like no one had any answers. The strange symbols, the rituals, and the terrifying message they had uncovered, "The island will take what it is owed," were no longer just academic curiosities. They were a horrifying reality, one that threatened to consume them all. The island, it seemed, was more than just a piece of land, it was a living entity, with a hunger that could not be satiated. And now it had set its sights on them. They had to leave, but leaving was no longer an option. Dr. Hartley, ever the historian, began to piece together the threads of the island's history in his mind. He had always believed that history was a series of events that could be understood and explained, but now he saw how wrong he had been. This island, this forsaken place, had always existed on the fringes of human understanding, existing in a realm between myth and reality. It had never been fully erased from the collective memory of those who had lived near it, but no one had dared to explore its depths until now. The people who had come here, the settlers who had vanished, had been driven by a force they couldn't understand. They had made a terrible mistake, a pact with something older than time itself, and now the price had come due. Eleanor Price, the anthropologist, began to notice something else. As she studied the island's remnants, she realized that the rituals they had uncovered were not merely symbolic. They were functional. Each symbol, each marking was part of a system, a way to communicate with something that had been dormant, waiting for centuries, and that something had been awakened. She spent hours poring over the texts, trying to decipher the meaning behind the symbols, but they were far too complex for her to understand in such a short time. Still, one thing became increasingly clear. Whatever had happened on the island in the past was repeating itself now. The settlers had paid the price for their curiosity, and now the island was demanding payment again. Isaac Bennett, the cryptographer, continued to work on decoding the messages they had found, but as he did, his mind began to unravel. The more he focused on the ancient symbols, the more the lines blurred between the logical and the illogical. It was as though the island's power was seeping into his very thoughts, making it harder and harder to distinguish reality from the visions and dreams that began to plague him. He would see fleeting glimpses of people from the past, their faces twisted in terror as they vanished before his eyes. He began to hear voices, low whispers that echoed in his mind, calling him to the dark corners of the island. He had always believed in the power of codes and ciphers, but now he was beginning to question whether the symbols on this island were even meant to be understood. Perhaps their true meaning was beyond human comprehension altogether. The more they worked, the more they realized how little they actually knew. They had uncovered pieces of the puzzle, but the full picture was still elusive. The symbols, the rituals, the cryptic messages, they were all pointing toward one thing. An ancient force, one that existed in a place outside of time and space, waiting to be awakened. But what was this force? And what did it want from them? As the team continued their search, their sense of time began to slip away. The island itself seemed to distort their perception of reality. Days passed in a blur, and the boundaries between night and day began to fade. It felt as if they were trapped in a perpetual twilight, suspended in some otherworldly state. The island was not just a place. They were beginning to believe it was a presence, something that had always existed just beneath the surface of their understanding. One evening, as they gathered around the campfire, the team began to discuss their next move. They were all aware that they couldn't stay much longer, that the island's influence was growing stronger by the hour. But no one could bring themselves to leave. It wasn't just fear, it was something more. The island had a hold on them, a subtle, insidious pull that made it difficult to break free. They were drawn to it as if it were calling them, drawing them deeper into its heart. It was then that Dr. Hartley made a decision. They couldn't leave without understanding what had happened to the island's original inhabitants, the settlers who had vanished without a trace. He had to know what they had done, what they had uncovered, and what they had awakened. It was the only way to make sense of it all, to understand why they were being pulled into this nightmare. The next morning, the team set out once again, this time to explore the deeper reaches of the island. They trekked through the dense jungle, following a path that seemed to lead them further and further from the shore. The air was thick with humidity, and the only sounds were the distant calls of unseen creatures. They didn't speak much as they walked, each of them lost in their own thoughts, consumed by the mystery that had brought them here. Eventually they arrived at a clearing, one that seemed strangely familiar. It was here they realized that the settlers had likely performed their final rituals, the ones that had sealed the island's fate. The clearing was surrounded by ancient stone pillars, covered in the same cryptic symbols they had seen throughout the island. In the center of the clearing was a large stone altar, worn down by centuries of weathering, but still imposing in its presence. Dr. Hartley approached the altar cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel it now, the weight of the island's power, the presence that seemed to radiate from the stone. It was almost as if the altar itself was alive, waiting for something to awaken it. As he stood there, staring at the altar, a feeling washed over him. He wasn't just standing in the clearing anymore. He could see it, the island as it had once been, filled with life. He could see the settlers, their faces filled with awe and fear as they gathered around the altar, performing their ancient rites. But he could also see something else. There was a presence among them, something that didn't belong, something that had been awakened by their rituals. In that moment, Hartley understood the truth. The settlers had not come to the island by chance. They had been drawn here, led by an ancient force that had been waiting for them. And in their desperation to escape their pasts, they had made a pact with it, a pact that would cost them everything. The island had claimed its price, and now it was ready to claim theirs. The realization hit him like a wave, crashing over him with a force he could not resist. The island had never been just a place. It was a living entity, a force of nature that demanded sacrifice. And now they were the ones who would have to pay the price. The team gathered around the altar, staring at the symbols that had once been part of an ancient ritual. The answers they sought were here, buried beneath the earth, but it was clear now that the truth came with a price that none of them could escape. As the wind began to pick up, and the sky darkened with ominous clouds, the team realized that they were not alone on the island. The presence was closing in around them, and they could feel its power growing stronger with every passing second. It was not a force they could escape. It was a force that had always been there, waiting for them to uncover the truth. And now the island was ready to collect what it was owed. The island had transformed from a simple mystery to something far more sinister. What had once been a place of curiosity was now a place of absolute terror, a place where reality bent and shifted with each passing hour. The team, already on edge, began to feel the full weight of their situation. They were no longer just outsiders trying to solve a puzzle. They were part of the island's dark story, and the island itself seemed determined to make them understand the consequences of their intrusion. The presence around them was no longer subtle. It had grown stronger, more tangible, pressing in from all sides. The air was thick with something unspoken, something oppressive, and the very land seemed to vibrate with a hidden energy. The island was alive, and it was aware of their every move. They had hoped that understanding its past would give them a way out, but now they understood. There was no leaving, not without paying a price. As the group stood in the clearing, still trying to comprehend the enormity of what they had uncovered, the symbols on the altar seemed to shift before their eyes. They could almost hear them whispering, a language that was at once ancient and primal, yet disturbingly familiar. The sensation was overpowering. These weren't just markings. They were alive, connected to something far beyond their comprehension. Each symbol was a part of a larger puzzle, a map that pointed toward something hidden beneath the island, something that had been buried for centuries. They had known it was coming, but no one had been prepared for the moment it finally arrived. The first sign was subtle. A shift in the air, a disturbance in the dense atmosphere. A sudden drop in temperature, enough to make them shiver, even in the heat of the tropical island. Then, a low rumble, almost imperceptible, began to shake the ground beneath their feet. It wasn't the sound of thunder or an approaching storm, it was something else. Something that seemed to come from the very depths of the island. The trees, once still and silent, began to sway, their leaves rustling in a rhythm that didn't match the wind. The earth seemed to groan, as if the island itself was waking from a long slumber. Eleanor was the first to notice something unusual. As the ground continued to shake, she saw movement in the shadows beyond the clearing. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, slipped between the trees, vanishing into the darkness before she could fully process what she had seen. It wasn't human, at least not in any way she recognized. There was something wrong with it. Its movements were too quick, too fluid, and its shape, long and distorted, seemed to defy logic. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Dr. Hartley turned toward her, his face pale as he sensed the shift in the atmosphere. Before he could ask her what was wrong, they all heard it, a low, guttural noise like the sound of something dragging itself across the earth. "Did you hear that?" Isaac whispered, his voice trembling. He had seen it too. The thing in the shadows. The team was no longer sure whether they were dealing with the supernatural or the psychological toll of being on the island for so long, but the fear in their eyes was undeniable. They had uncovered something terrible, something that had been buried, hidden away in the darkest corners of the island. And now it was awake. As the figure emerged again, this time more clearly, the team realized that they were no longer alone. The creature, or whatever it was, stepped into the clearing, its form indistinct and shifting. It looked like a man, but it wasn't. Its features were blurred, impossible to define. It seemed to distort the air around it like a mirage flickering in and out of focus. And it was walking toward them. Panic surged through the group. They backed away, their hearts pounding in their chests. The creature was moving slowly, methodically, its eyes locked onto them, though they could not tell where its eyes were. It was as if it didn't need eyes to see them. It simply knew they were there. Rachel's voice, weak and trembling, broke through the chaos. It's not just a creature," she said, her voice faint but clear. "It's part of the island. It's the curse." Her words hit them like a cold slap. Rachel, despite her delirium, had seen something they hadn't. She had been the one to connect the dots, to realize that the island was not just a location, it was a living thing with its own will, its own hunger. And the settlers had woken it. Dr. Hartley's mind raced. He understood now, the island wasn't just a place where people had lived and died. It was a repository of energy, a conduit for something ancient, something far beyond the human understanding of time and space. The settlers had stumbled upon something they weren't meant to find, and in doing so, they had disturbed the island's slumber. The rituals, the symbols, the mysterious force, they were all connected to this entity, this living, breathing thing that had been feeding on the souls of the island's inhabitants for centuries. The team's terror deepened as they realized they had not been searching for answers. They had been awakening something that had been buried, something that had always been waiting. And now it was demanding its due. The creature in front of them was not just a manifestation of the island's power, it was the island itself. The long, twisted figure that had once been human, or perhaps had never been human at all, was an extension of the land's hunger. It was a manifestation of the curse that had been placed upon the island, the force that had consumed the settlers and now sought to claim them as well. Isaac stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We're too late," he muttered. "It's already too late." The air around them thickened, a dense, suffocating presence that seemed to close in from all directions. The island was alive and it was not going to let them leave. The creature's form shifted, its limbs stretching unnaturally long, its body contorting in impossible ways. Its mouth, a wide gash that split its face, opened slowly, and the sound that emanated from it was not a voice but a wail, a low, continuous moan that seemed to resonate from deep within the earth itself. The team could only stand frozen, paralyzed by fear as the creature advanced. They knew they could not fight it. They could not outrun it. They were trapped. And they had no idea what would happen next. Suddenly there was a loud crack, followed by an eerie, high-pitched shriek. The ground beneath their feet shook violently, and the trees around them began to bend and twist as if caught in a powerful wind, though no breeze stirred. The island seemed to be alive, its very foundations shifting as if it was preparing to consume them whole. It was as if the creature had summoned the island itself to respond to their intrusion. Dr. Hartley's heart raced as he realized the full extent of their mistake. The settlers had not simply left the island, they had been consumed by it, body and soul. The rituals, the symbols, they were not meant to guide the island's inhabitants. They were meant to feed it, to keep it alive. And now the island was ready to feed again. He turned to the team, his voice shaking. "We have to get out of here. We have to leave. Now." But it was too late. As he spoke, the island seemed to close around them, its grip tightening like a vice. The creature, now more formless than ever, seemed to be everywhere at once, its presence suffocating, all-consuming. The team moved as one, running through the clearing, but it felt as if the island itself was shifting to block their escape, closing in around them. The last thing Dr. Hartley saw was the shadow of the creature looming over him, its distorted face stretching into something that resembled a grin. And then the ground gave way beneath his feet. The island had claimed its price. And they had paid it. The air on the island was thick with a sense of finality. What had once been a place of mystery had now become a tomb, one that seemed to swallow up every trace of life that dared to cross its threshold. The team's frantic attempts to escape had proven futile. The island, it seemed, had become an entity unto itself, its power so overwhelming that no one could stand against it. As they ran, they realized with a sinking heart that the island had already decided their fate. There was no escape from its grasp, no way to undo the damage they had unwittingly unleashed. Dr. Hartley, his mind racing, tried to make sense of it all. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. The island was not just a place, it was a living, breathing organism, a force that had always existed, hidden from the world. It had been waiting, dormant for centuries, until the settlers had come, disturbed its slumber, and unknowingly begun a ritual that had awakened something far darker than any of them had anticipated. The entity that had emerged from the shadows was not just an ancient curse, it was the island itself, an insatiable hunger that had been fed by every soul it had claimed. The settlers had been the first to fall victim to it, and now the team had become the latest offerings. The shadows seemed to close in tighter with every passing second, and the ground beneath their feet shifted, undulating like something alive. The island was reshaping itself, adjusting its terrain to keep them trapped, its very landscape conspiring against them. It was as if the land itself was a part of the curse, a physical manifestation of the island's wrath, an entity that had no interest in allowing anyone to leave. The creature, if it could even be called that, was everywhere. Its form, ever-changing, flickered at the edges of their vision, an amorphous, nightmarish thing that defied logic. It wasn't something that could be understood, only felt. It moved in and out of the shadows, its presence constantly shifting, an overwhelming force that seemed to track their every movement. At times, it appeared as a grotesque figure, its limbs unnaturally long and twisted, and at other moments, it was nothing more than a blur, a dark stain that marred the landscape itself. But it was always there, watching, waiting, and drawing nearer. Isaac Bennett, his mind unraveling from the sheer terror of it all, stumbled through the dense underbrush, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His vision blurred, not from exhaustion but from something else, something far more sinister. The symbols, the language, the ritual, they were all merging in his mind, each piece of the puzzle clicking together in a maddening cacophony. He had seen the island's hunger, the dark force that had claimed the settlers, but now as he ran he began to hear voices. Low whispers that spoke in the same language as the symbols. It was as if the island was trying to communicate with him, trying to pull him deeper into its web. Eleanor Price too felt the pull. The anthropologist had spent years studying isolated cultures, but nothing could have prepared her for the horror that now unfolded before her. The island's power was not just a supernatural force, it was a presence, one that reached into her very soul, turning her thoughts against her. The more she fought against it, the more it wrapped itself around her, tightening its grip. She could feel the island pressing in on her, its whispers growing louder, more insistent, urging her to understand. But what was it trying to tell her? And why did she feel as though she were being led somewhere she didn't want to go? As they continued to flee, they began to realize that the island wasn't just altering the physical landscape, it was warping their perceptions of time and space. What had seemed like hours of running had, in reality, been mere minutes. They had moved in circles, retracing their own steps, as though the island itself had turned into a maze with no exit. The familiar landmarks, trees, rocks, and trails, had shifted, and what had once been a clear path now seemed to lead them deeper into the heart of the island. The very ground beneath them felt unstable, as if it were actively shifting, swallowing their tracks. Suddenly the ground gave way beneath them. A deep rumbling sound erupted from the earth, and the team found themselves falling, tumbling down into a dark, gaping hole in the ground. It felt as though the island had opened its mouth, swallowing them whole, and they had no choice but to descend into the abyss. When they landed, it was not on solid ground, but on something softer, eerily familiar. The air was thick and oppressive, and the silence that surrounded them was suffocating. It was as though the island had swallowed them whole and placed them in some otherworldly realm, a place where the laws of nature no longer applied. The darkness was absolute, and for a moment, the team could do nothing but stand there, disoriented, trying to adjust to the crushing weight of the silence. As their eyes began to adjust to the dark, they realized they were no longer standing in a cave as they had expected, but in an ancient underground structure, an enormous, ruined chamber that stretched out before them. The walls were adorned with the same symbols they had seen all over the island, symbols that pulsed with an eerie light as though alive. The ground beneath their feet was made of stone, but the stone was not cold. It was warm to the touch, as though it were breathing, alive with an ancient energy that seemed to flow through the very air they breathed. In the center of the chamber was a large, flat stone slab, its surface smooth and worn by time. It seemed to radiate an unnatural heat, as though it were the source of the island's power. The slab was inscribed with more symbols, but these were different. More complex, more intricate, as though they had been created by a different hand, a different civilization. They weren't just markings, they were part of something far more intricate, a key to unlocking the island's deepest secrets. Dr. Hartley, his mind racing with fear and realization, approached the slab, feeling an inexplicable pull. He could feel the weight of centuries pressing down on him, the island's ancient power surging through him. He knew what he had to do. The island had been waiting for them, had been drawing them in all along. The settlers, the rituals, the symbols, it was all connected, a vast, complex web that had been set in motion long before they arrived. He placed his hand on the stone slab, and the moment he did, a deafening sound erupted from deep within the island. It was as though the earth itself had awakened, and in that moment, Dr. Hartley understood the truth. The island was not just a place, it was a living, breathing entity, one that had been feeding on the souls of those who had come before them. It had been waiting for them to make the final move, to unlock the last piece of the puzzle. The slab began to glow, the symbols pulsing with an unnatural light, and the air around them thickened with a sense of impending doom. The island had been feeding on its victims for centuries, and now, it was ready to claim them as well. They had been drawn into its trap and there was no way out. The island had fed on the souls of the settlers and now, it was hungry for more. The team, unaware of the true nature of the island until it was too late, had become part of the sacrifice. The island had been waiting for this moment, for them to uncover the final piece of its dark puzzle. The ground beneath them shook violently, and the walls of the chamber began to crack, as if the island was alive, shaking with the anticipation of its next meal. The creature, the force that had been following them, emerged from the shadows, its form shifting and changing as it began to move toward them, its presence now overwhelming. The team was powerless to stop it. The island had claimed its price, and they had paid it. The air in the chamber had thickened to a suffocating weight, and the island's grip on the team was unmistakable. Every movement they made seemed to be weighed down by the presence of something far older and far more powerful than any of them had ever anticipated. They stood in the heart of the island, surrounded by the pulsating energy that emanated from the stone slab. Each symbol carved into the walls seemed to hum with an unnatural life of its own. The island, alive with its own ancient power, was no longer just a backdrop to their investigation. It was a living entity, and they had unwittingly woken it from its long slumber. The glow from the symbols grew brighter as they touched the stone, each pulse of light like the beat of a heart, echoing through the chamber. The stone beneath their feet seemed to tremble, as though the entire island was shifting beneath them. Dr. Hartley's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. He had been so close to uncovering the truth, but now he realized that the truth was far more terrible than any of them had imagined. This island was no place for humans. It was a dark and ancient force, one that had devoured countless souls over the centuries, and now it was hungry again. Isaac's breath came in short, panicked gasps. His hands trembled as he gripped the edges of the stone, feeling the warmth radiating from it. He could feel the pulse of the island beneath his skin, the overwhelming sense that they were no longer in control of their fate. The whispers in his mind had grown louder, and now they were not just distant murmurs but clear voices, urging him to understand, to listen. The words were unintelligible, but the meaning behind them was clear. The island was speaking, and it demanded more. Eleanor stood frozen, her gaze fixed on the creature that now seemed to emerge from the darkness of the chamber. It was no longer a mere figure in the shadows but a full, physical manifestation of the island's hunger. Its form was grotesque and ever-changing, an amalgamation of twisted limbs and shifting shadows. At first, it had been impossible to define, a shifting shape that flickered in and out of existence, but now it was more tangible. Its movements were slow but deliberate, each step taking it closer to the group. As it moved, the air around it seemed to distort, warping the space in a way that made it hard to focus on anything for more than a few seconds. It wasn't just a creature, it was the island itself, a manifestation of its deep, insatiable hunger. The creature's face, when it finally came into view, was barely recognizable as human. The features had been twisted and elongated, the eyes hollow and dark. Its mouth was a gaping chasm, stretching wide enough to swallow a person whole. There were no words, no voice to its movements, just an overwhelming sense of presence. The presence of something ancient, something that had always been there, waiting, and now it was closing in.